Okay, so I'm here with Pete Fox Jr., science teacher with Middletown School District, also a coach for 19 years. Part of those 19 years, you were a trainer. I believe it was for about 15 years
That's correct.
for the football players and other athletes as well. Um, so thank you very much for joining me. Let's start from your childhood. You said your father was a teacher in the Middletown area school district, and you went to a lot of Middletown football games. Do you mind just talking about that growing up and your experiences with Middletown as a football team and as a community?
Sure. My father was employed at Middletown School District. He started in 1963, 1964 school year. That was the year that the building, it's either the first or second year that the building had opened, the old school building, which no longer exists. He was a woodshop teacher. He coached track and field. He was an assistant football coach in the 1960s. And as a boy, we would go to Middletown's varsity games when I was a boy. So I'd go along with my dad, and we watched many amazing teams that I saw play as a boy. I saw Cliff Brown play quarterback, and Ed Tennis, and saw some amazing teams. Saw Middletown play Steelton a couple times, and some games that are quite well remembered at Middletown.
Is there anything you want to share, or you know that sticks out as a memory for the Ed Tennis, Cliff Brown, or even those Steelton matchups? I know those were some really good teams back then.
Well, what I remember best is I do remember coaches Don Gilbert and Charlie Harding. My father's an assistant, knew them, and I did as well, because they often would have social things. They'd have families over. And Dave Yon he didn't coach with Dave Yon. He was friends with Dave Yon. But I remember even as a boy watching Dave Yon coach, and he was quite the chess master of game of football, of knowing how to get matchups, how to make things work, how to defend people, how to find what worked offensively. He was really quite impressive, and the schedule they played was tough then too. They played Cumberland Valley. They played some of the schools that after the Mid-Penn came around and it wasn't the Capital Area Conference, they played a tough schedule at that time, and some much larger schools. And those were impressive. He had some very good teams. And I was fortunate enough when I came into coaching that I sat down with Dave Yon a couple times, and he did some tutorials with me at the beginning of my coaching career, and that made an impression on me as well.
What were some of the things he taught you?
One of the impressions was you hear about people who are very creative, and maybe people who are songwriters and keep blank paper around. When they have an idea, they'll jot it down. And he had a little chalkboard. I think it was in his kitchen. If he thought of something, whether it was the middle of the night or wherever, something, a play, a defense, he would write it down. He mostly talked to me about basics, about real fundamental things, which are important for any coach. You need that foundation. You need to build on those fundamentals about how to approach just real basic things. Your alignment, your stance, your start. How to read, how to react. That's what I remember the most from that meeting with Dave. But I remember being quite grateful that he took the time to do that with me.
So actually, if you don't mind, I'll pick your brain a little bit, going back to this time period of the 60s and early 70s, obviously very different from today. The technology wasn't there that we have today. You mentioned Coach on playing chess as far as matchups and things like that. I'm curious how they would do scouting and just game planning as a whole for a coaching staff back then.
Well, really, Chris, when I came into coaching, not that much had changed there. So when we scouted, when I started as a young coach, Coach Etsy was the head coach at that time. I don't remember scouting much when I coached my first year with Larry Donovan, but Coach Etsy required us to have 3 coaches that would go to a scout. So 3 coaches would go, and we had a set of papers. You could put 3 offensive plays on each paper for the offensive part. And I was one of the coaches that would write down plays. So I had a clipboard. I'd open up to a page, and a coach would talk. A coach would say, it's 2nd down and 7, the ball's on the right hash mark. And then they'd often tell me the formation. It's a wing right eye. And I'd start to draw. And then I'd look up about the time play would start. I might be responsible for watching the backs. Somebody else might be responsible for watching the lineman on one side. Somebody else might be responsible for watching the receivers. And just that quick, I would have to draw the play on the paper. Then go to the next one. Somebody say, now it's 3rd and 4. Ball's in the middle of the field. And it looks like they're coming out in the power eye right. I'd have to start drawing again. And that's what you would do. And on defense, they had different things that you would draw up for different formations. You know, when the offense shows a certain formation, what's the defensive alignment? What's the secondary look like? There were also places where we would write impressions we had, just impressions about the team. They seem very quick. They're fast. They're big. They have certain players. You know, we'd notice a certain player. We'd make notes about personnel. At that time, when we lacked that technology, we would trade films. So after a game, they were the old films on the reel. So we would have to drop the film off. I remember it was at the old Howard and Johnson's on the Eisenhower Boulevard. We dropped the film off there Friday night, and then Sunday we'd be able to pick up the films. And I remember being questioned by the girl that handed them to us, and she smiled and said, "What kind of films are these?" She thought they were pornography. She didn't know we were picking up football films. And she didn't even believe us. Yeah, she said, "I'm sure that's football. Yeah, I know that's what you guys watch." But that was what we watched. Anyway, so we did not have the option of looking at even Saturday. So we had to have our strategic meetings on Sunday, because that's when it was available that we could assess what had happened in the game. And we would trade with the other team for 2 of their games. So that was an important thing with Coach Etsy. The scouts would often make the trades. They had to make sure they got the right games, not games that were too old. And that was a big deal there. So I think at that time in the 60s, a lot of that was the same. They had film. In fact, I looked at film from the 60s when I started coaching. I saw Harvey Colston on film because I was curious. I wanted to see what he was like as a player. And we looked at some of the other game films that were around. Many of them were missing, but we did see some of them. So that technology was similar when I started my coaching to probably what it was in the 60s.
So you would drop it off on a Friday. Would you meet with the other team's coaches there and just like hand it off, or how that work?
So the team we were going to play the following week did not get the game film from the game that was just played. They got the film from the 2 previous games. So we played on Friday. They got the one from a week before and 2 weeks before. The scouts would take that when they scouted and make the trade with the other team. So if we were playing Central Dauphin the next week, the scouts, the junior high coaches would take the 2 old films, trade with their coaches on the sidelines, or else they would come to our game and trade there. Yeah, it was very different. And we would actually scout on paper games that we wound up getting on film, which was kind of puzzling to me. But Coach Etsy also wanted to make sure he had those scout books. That was something he depended on very heavily.
And how long did you do the scouting?
How long? When I was when I coached junior high. Now, the first year I coached, I was a junior high assistant when Larry Donovan coached. The following year was Dennis Etsy's first year, and I was head freshman coach. And I'm glad those kids survived that, because I didn't know much and I wasn't very good. I tried my best, but I really didn't know very much. Then the following year, I was the head line coach of varsity, so my ascent was pretty rapid. When I was a varsity assistant with Dennis Etsy that was 83, 84, 85, 86, 87, 88. There were 6 seasons. I would scout with him. And then afterwards, I was a junior high coach, and I was a school's athletic trainer. Well, because I was school's athletic trainer, I could not scout on a Friday night because I had to be on the sideline of the game. And since I'd worked with him and studied a lot of film, Coach Etsy would give me videos of the opponents and have me study them myself, take my own notes as an individual and take those into him. And that was in lieu of scouting. He liked comparing what I saw to what he and the other coaches saw. Often I'd see the same thing. Sometimes I might see a little wrinkle that they didn't see. And that's what I did in lieu of scouting at that time.
So some of the people that I've interviewed about their Middletown playing years, one of the biggest things they've pointed out was how well prepared Coach Etsy was and just the coaching staff in general. And I think the scouting reports are a part of that. I've had some people bring up about the smallest details just being pointed out and prepared for, and taught to the players that week, that game. Dennis Moore brought up Central Dolphins halfback always wore gloves. When he took that glove off, you knew it was a halfback pass. So he said all the sophomores, game time, that was their job. Yell out halfback pass if they noticed that. And sure enough, they did it, and you guys got an interception. So I think that's awesome that, you guys took it that serious, and it trickled down to the players, and they really took that to heart and used it to their advantage.
Mm-hmm.
So not really a question there. I'm just pointing that out.
No, but Coach Etsy had in his playbook, he had a philosophy of coaching page. And there was one very concise point in there, which was very telling about his philosophy. He said, discipline is organization. And not everyone would agree with that. I think discipline's much more. But that was very important to Dennis Etsy. And he would often say, I do not like looking disorganized. He'd say it a little differently, but he hated looking disorganized. So part of that came into scouting, preparing for games. And when we had Sunday meetings, they would often go from, once in a while we'd start at 2 o'clock, usually 4 o'clock. We'd often be there till about 9 o'clock. And a big part of it was putting together the scout packet. So that would involve the other team's offenses, the other team's defenses, all their plays, how we will block against their defenses, their kicking game, their personnel. He had a cover sheet that he put on. That was a big part of it. So some of that was actually, much of that was actually handwritten. And then they would ditto that off and have to staple them together and hand them out. But that philosophy of discipline as organization, nobody outworked Dennis. You can say what you want about Coach Etsy, and nobody outworked him. He was very organized and worked very hard.
You graduate Lower Dolph in 1976.
Right.
Just a couple years after that, you're on the Middletown coaching staff. Do you mind just talking about how you ended up joining the staff?
I joined the staff. Well, my first boss and principal was Mr. Berner. Mr. Berner was, athletics were important to him. Track and field was very important to him. And I actually had experience coaching collegiate track for a year. And he was very interested in me coaching track. I'm sure that helped me get the job more than my credentials in biology. So that was there. And I was asked when I was interviewed if I would coach football. And I agreed to coach football that season for the lofty sum of $600. And that was how that played out.
All right. So you joined 1981. Coach Donovan was the head coach.
Right.
I honestly, I have no clue about this. What happened with him leaving the program, and how did Dennis Etsy come into Middletown?
Well, the way I understand it, Larry was an assistant under Terry Eberly. And I don't know what happened with Terry, whether he resigned, was asked to resign, but Terry was done. And it's my understanding that they had another candidate that they wanted to hire. And something happened, I think it was late, like June, where it fell through. And they did not have a head coach. So their first move was to go to assistants. Larry Donovan was interested in taking the job. At the end of the season, they tried to talk as though, this is according to Larry, what I remember from Larry was that they talked as though it was an interim position, and it wasn't presented to him in that way. And he was upset about that. So that's how I remember it, and what I remember Larry saying to me back at the time. So Larry didn't officially go through that whole process where they interview a number of candidates. He was willing to do the job, and he did the best he could with it. And they interviewed after that season.
In comes Dennis Etsy. Do you mind talking a little bit about your first introductions, your first meetings with him? What was the feeling? What was the vibe like with a new head coach and it being Dennis Etsy?
Well, I didn't quite know what to expect. I'd only worked with one other head coach. It was Larry Donovan, and I had known him. And that year, I actually taught at the middle school at the old Feeser building. I taught science. And Coach Etsy came to the building after school to meet me and talk with me. And I really had very little memory of that meeting and my impressions at that time. But he was pretty calm. It was very different from the way he would be during the season. Now, one of my more vivid memories was either the first or second day of practice. For some reason, I didn't have a car. My wife dropped me off very early, and I was in the coach's office, and coach showed up. And he was angry. Nobody else was there. He was really angry. He had one of those metal thermoses, and the old ones used to have a glass liner on the inside. And he had dropped it, and his coffee was in there. It sounded like it had crushed ice in because all that glass broke in there. And he was slamming things down saying, "I need my coffee." It's not completely what he said, but "I need my coffee." I said, "Well, coach, I don't have a car here, but if you want, I'll go get some coffee for you." So I was just glad to get away from him at that point. He was so wound up. So I took his car and got him his coffee at 7-Eleven and came back. It was a little bit different. He was very intense. You know, when his game face went on, it was a whole different ball game.
Do you remember players meeting him for the first time and what their reaction or response was to him?
Well, I'll tell you, one of my most recent was Brady Fox. And Brady Fox went to Stevens Tech. And Brady came back, and Brady always talks, and it's funny, people ask if he's my kid, but we aren't related at all. But Brady's talked to me. I said, "Well, how's it going? How's football going?" He said, "Oh, I'm injured now." I said, "Well, how you doing with Coach Etsy?" He said, "I thought he'd be kind of chill because he's a little older, but, but he isn't." That's a pretty typical reaction. He's pretty intense.
What positions did you coach for Middletown?
Mm-hmm. Well, I started out coaching offensive line, and that's what I coached on varsity. On varsity, I was the head offensive line coach with Dennis for those years in the 80s. When I decided to coach junior high, and it was my own choice. You really put in a lot of time with coach, and we're getting ready to start a family, and I wanted to not spend that much time there. And I was always honest with coach. I didn't really ever eat, drink, and sleep football. I liked it, but it's different for a head coach. It has to be different. But when I coached junior high, he told me he wanted me to coach the running backs and quarterbacks. And I learned that. So when I went to coach junior high, I had the background where I knew all the offensive line blocking, and I learned all the steps for the quarterbacks and running backs. So I really knew the offense quite well then at that point. On defense, I started out coaching defensive ends with him. I'd coached secondary with Larry Donovan, but I didn't learn that much in that year. And that's not Larry's fault. Coach Etsy was actually very good at clinicking us and teaching us. And he took a lot of time to make his coaches knowledgeable coaches. On the defensive side of the ball, I started coaching defensive ends. And after that, I coached defensive tackles. I really liked coaching defensive tackles. So even in junior high, I usually coached defensive line then. Well, I enjoyed many things, but I remember some of them fondly for certain reasons. In the fall of 1984, that was a season where Middletown had had about half a dozen losing consecutive seasons. And Coach Etsy in his first season was 3-8, and I think it was 3-7-1 his second season. Second season, we should have been better. Everybody got hurt. We got so many kids hurt. Lost almost all our running backs. And then that third season, we were 9-3. We went to the playoffs. And back then, only 4 teams made it for each division. So we were one of 4 teams in our bracket for AAA to make it. And that season, we had some big wins. We beat Steelton. It was the first time Middletown ever beat Steelton. We had a big win over Redland. Our league was actually very, very strong. Hershey had a nice team. Redland was good. Lower Dauphin was good. We had a nice, solid team. It was a really tough league that year, and we had some really good wins. And it was very special. As time went on, one of the things you want to establish is your players expect to win. But at that time, they didn't. And every win was just so much more special at that point. And I remember that team and a lot of those players very fondly. I think about the '86 team. And that was a team that finished out the season with a win in the playoffs, because district playoffs was as far as you could go. And that was a team that had a lot of really nice players on it that were a quite enjoyable group that I remain in contact with a number of those players. And as I coached junior high, the year may have been, let me take a look at my notes here. It's either 95 or 96. And Kyle Keating was a freshman then, and he was our quarterback. And that team, I think they lost a game and tied a game, but they won 2 games on the final play of the game on long passes. Beat Central Dauphin on the last play of the game on a long pass. We also beat Mechanicsburg on the final play of the game on a long pass. And we beat Harrisburg as well. And Harrisburg was ahead by 2 scores with about 6 minutes left in the game. And we ran the 2-minute drill for the last 2 possessions. And the kids beat Harrisburg. Those Harrisburg kids were really upset about that. But that was a fun win. And Kyle was so talented from a young age as a quarterback. And I had a very simple 2-minute offense, and he was able to execute it. And the other kids executed as well. But that team was a lot of fun, and they were nice kids too. So, but there are so many different teams. I mean, it's not always about winning. Sometimes you can have the team that wins the most games and have the most difficulties with upset parents and upset players, and sometimes have teams that have mediocre records, but they have been a good team and cooperated and improved, and that's just as rewarding.
Do you have any other coaches that made a lasting impression on you?
Other coaches?
Yes.
Well, I certainly learned a lot from Coach Etsy. And as I said, his real Spartan work ethic. Mike Donguy was one of my closest friends when he was here at Middletown with the job. And I remain in contact with Mike Donguy, even though he doesn't live in the area. And Roy O'Neill, I only coached a single season with Roy, but Roy's a supportive friend, who I often talk to at school. And there are many assistants. When you're working closely with other people like that, you develop friendships, people like Mike Schatz and Scott Pettis. And I still hear from Joe Taylor, even though he doesn't live around here. So those are bonds that form, and those are lifelong friendships that you get.
All right. What qualities did you try to teach players?
Well, I think you want to play fair. It's important to me how you play. You play hard. You play fair. I think you play smart. I think you learn as much as you can. You teach your players as much as you can. And they need to understand that. The value of working hard, that idea that hard work plus talent beats just talent. And I think that's important. It's really an extension of your education, the extracurriculars. And football is a real powerful vehicle to teach values, because as a coach, you're holding something those kids want so badly. They want to play. You want to get as many kids to play as you can, and really teach them some good values about hard work and cooperating with other people and respecting other people and winning with grace and losing with grace. You know, those are important things, I think.
Walk me through what a typical game day would be like for you, including any types of routines or things you did consistently.
Well, Chris, you know, for me, my first job was a teacher. You know, coaching football is an extracurricular activity. So I had a regular working day. Much of the time that I coached football, I was a school's athletic trainer. So while other coaches may have been doing other things, maybe they went out to get a bite to eat or something, I was in a training room getting the soccer players and field hockey players and everybody else ready for their practice. I was also covering practice until about that time that the varsity football players would come in to get taped up too. So that consumed a good bit of my day, the fact that I was the school's athletic trainer at the same time I was coach. And I was fortunate the district allowed me to do that. You know, that's very uncommon. It's really not very common for somebody to be a full-time teacher and an athletic trainer, let alone be allowed to coach, teach, and be a trainer. So that was kind of unique to me. Some of the other coaches had little rituals that I would see. Not so much for me. They used to make fun of what I would eat. I would go get the same kind of thing every day, but every game, I just usually go down to Fox's and grab a sandwich or something. And sometimes I'd grab a loaf of raisin bread. They'd make fun of me for eating raisin bread, but that was one of the things that I would eat. And one time I didn't. We lost the game, and Coach Etsy told me I had to eat raisin bread every. But I'm not real superstitious, and yeah. So, like I said, and it didn't really. That's different for me than a head coach. It didn't consume me. I did what I was supposed to do, but then I went about my work day. And I'm sure for Coach Etsy, who had much more on the line, his day, you know, it was probably distracting for him going through his work day with everything he had on the line than what I had on the line.
Yeah, you certainly did have a lot. I don't know if I ever really realized how much you had to do with all the other sports and things and teaching. Like that's a lot to deal with.
Yeah. Maybe a little nervous about the game, excited, and eager to get it started. There was a notorious group of fans that we used to call the chain gang. And between the concession stand and where they would rope it off, those guys would be right there. And I used to intentionally kind of run along and look them right in the eye and say, "Hey, how you doing?" You know, kind of look them right in the eye as I ran to the sideline, you know, and kind of smile at them. But no, I don't remember that well. I remember that the cheerleaders always wanted us to run through some kind of hoop or something, and we always ran around it. The kids ran through it, but we would always run around it.
Well, you mentioned the fans.
Yeah.
I'm always interested to hear people's responses to this. How would you describe Middletown fans?
My junior year at Lower Dauphin, we played Middletown for homecoming. And we were ahead in that game by 10 points, 24-14. And Middletown came back and won 28-24 in a thriller. And one of my biggest impressions of the game were the fans. And I remember people throwing things at our bus when we left and thinking, wow, this is a rough place. And then I wound up working here for 40 years, but our fans are demanding, and our fans are loyal. And those are two of the big words, but they are quite demanding, and they have a high set of expectations for Middletown football. I remember going to a game down at James Buchanan, and I was a fan. I wasn't coaching that year. It was when Coach Don Guy was coaching. we must have been winning by 40, 50 points. Fourth quarter. And James Buchanan throws a halfback pass and scores a touchdown. Well, there weren't enough seats on the James Buchanan side for all the Middletown fans. So Middletown fans were on the James Buchanan side where I was. They scored this touchdown. Some of their kids started going crazy. And they almost got in a fight with the Middletown fans over it. I didn't care. They scored a touchdown. They were allowed to be happy, but that rubbed some of the people a little bit wrong. So yeah, our fans take it quite seriously.
Is there anything you miss about coaching?
Well, the camaraderie with the other coaches, the relationships you get with the players, but that forms with other sports as well. So that's not unique to football. I coached track and field for more years than I coached football. I was head cross country coach, and you have those same bonds that form there. I think football is a hard sport to coach because of the year-round nature of it. You have workouts year-round and different kinds of camps to go to. It's very demanding. I mentioned a group in junior high in about 96, 95, 96 probably. And in that group of players, in that 1 or 2 year period, are several people who remained significant in my life. And I first met them when they were in junior high. The Evans twins. And Phil, I still see Phil, and we go fishing together. I'm in touch with Phil Evans quite frequently. Jason Kreider. I officiated a wedding ceremony for Jason and his wife. I was also officiant of a wedding ceremony for Dan Schaefer, Adam Schaefer's brother. I'm closer to Adam than Daniel. And JJ Ortiz is somebody that I've been close to as a colleague and as a friend. So it's very interesting in that group of athletes in that 2 years within those two classes are people that have remained significant. And Adam Schaefer is somebody who I coached, I taught, I coached with, and I taught with in the same department. And he's a supportive friend on top of it, as are those other men that I mentioned to you. So it's interesting, some of those coaches' relationships went into adult friendships.
Did you have a favorite game as a coach, or maybe even more than one? Some favorite games that stick in your
Well, I
head?
mentioned those unforgettable ones that we won on the long passes on the last play. That you just don't see that, especially in freshman football. But any game where I did my job in a way that allowed students or athletes to succeed, that was my favorite game.
How would you describe the Middletown football players you coached?
Oh my goodness, that's asking me to describe humanity, because we have every sort of person playing football that you can. Those highly motivated, those maybe sometimes you wonder why they're out there, those that stand up to everything, those that seem to break down, those that are very smart, those that are less smart, those that are physically able, those that overachieve, those that underachieve. So it is to describe humanity. We get all varieties of people there, and the challenge is to try to make them all achieve a little bit more than they thought they could achieve, and to understand that it's important sometimes to make some sacrifice for the greater good of a group.
But, with your answer, I think it brings up another good question. And you had a good perspective of it, probably more so with Dennis Etsy. But you do have all different types of personalities, strengths, weaknesses, you name it. You have, there's dichotomy involved in that locker room within those personalities. What did the coaches You can be specific about Coach Etsy if you want, or anybody else. How did you guys mold those teams and help them build their character?
I think different coaches have different roles. Sometimes it can almost be like good cop, bad cop too. Sometimes Coach Etsy was the disciplinarian, and sometimes the assistants got to be like the good cops, if that makes sense to you. I think he chose a philosophy which was close to Paterno-esque, that you never underestimated your opponent. You always looked at the potential of your opponent. You always tried to make that into a challenge. This team, even though their record might not be where it is, they might have the best running back in the league. Well, that's a way you motivate your running backs, by saying something like that. So you need to challenge them. You need to set the bar high. But the bar has to be realistic and believable as well. If I can't convince you that you can achieve this, if I can't sell you on it, you aren't going to achieve it. But that's not often the challenge. The challenge is often to convince players. Often players and athletes I've coached in other sports don't really understand their potential. And if you can be that person that explains that to them and shows them that, and they believe it, they can achieve more than they thought they could. And I think that's an attitude that the coaches would have that would permeate things. You start to develop a vision, you explain it, you believe it, and you get them to believe it as well.
How would you describe your coaching style?
Mine? Well, I'd like to think that I'm calm and thoughtful. I don't know if my athletes would all describe it that way, but that's what I would say I am.
You coached with 4 head coaches.
Yes.
We said it before. Donovan, Etsy, Dungai, and O'Neill. So talk about the differences between those coaches and kind of your roles on those staffs.
I mentioned earlier, Larry Donovan was there for a single season. I was a junior high assistant. I don't think he required me to come to the varsity's football camp, which in retrospect was a bit of a mistake because I could have learned a whole lot at that point. And my contact with him was pretty minimal, but at the end of the season, after the junior high season was over, I came to practices and helped with practice. My memories of that, it's a long time ago, are minimal. And as I said, it was only a single season. So my experiences with him were limited. I wasn't to a varsity game on the sidelines, I don't think. I was to one the entire season because generally when you were a junior high coach at that time, you would be scouting on a Friday night. You wouldn't be at the varsity game of the high school. Dennis Etsy, as I said, extremely hardworking. Also, what people might not know is he was a very good recruiter. In the high school game, recruiting is really important. You could have, if you have great football players, but they're walking the halls and they don't play, or people with potential don't come out, that hurts your team. So in the high school game, a coach needs to be a good recruiter to make sure that he has enough depth, enough players, and he would say things like, "Oh, don't sell a sophomore short." Sometimes you get a guy who is a sophomore, he's not that good a player, but if you work with him, get him to work out, get him more confident, teach him, he can become a good player as a senior. So he tried not to sell kids short. He tried to look for potential, and he was actually a good recruiter, and that was a part of his success at Middletown. There was one year, I think we had 88 kids on the roster. They'd line up in a game, and I think that intimidated the other team, seeing all those kids stand out there in the field in the warm-ups. Mike Dongai was also very organized. Mike was really good with technology. He was starting to bridge that difference between that old time everything on paper and things in technology. Mike had a good football background. Mike was different where he was, every head coach interacts differently with his staff. And Dennis would listen, but Dennis hit the point, Mr. Etsy, where he would say, this is my decision, this is what we're doing. Whereas Mike Dongai probably listened longer before he hit that point where he said, okay, as a head coach, this is the decision I'm now going to make. And that's different with every individual, how we work with other people. Mike Dongai was quite willing to work with the staff that he got from Dennis Etsy, which I think was wise. He had a well-schooled staff. He worked with that staff. He took things in the direction he wanted. And in some ways, I'd say he's a very flexible man, a flexible coach. He's a head football coach. Also a very energetic man. Roy O'Neill came to Middletown with great experience from Shippensburg University. He had a really thick playbook when he got here. I remember going through that whole thing, look at all the blocking schemes. That was very impressive. And he had off-season conditioning, which was really, really rigorous. And I remember looking at it and thinking, wow, that's a lot. And then we went to the first game that year and played East Pennsboro. And sometimes those August games or early September games can be really hot. And it wound up being a battle of attrition. And that actually paid off there. And I remember thinking that the conditioning may have been a little bit excessive, but he knew, and what he brought in paid off, at least in that particular game in that season. It's very different trying to compare the different coaches and the way they interact with their staff, the way they interact with their players. It's all different in the level of whether you're, democratic or authoritarian, how you interact with your staff. And it varies with everyone, but coaches can be successful coaches for a number of different reasons, in my opinion. Some football coaches know the game inside and out. You get to the game, and they're the person that can adjust. They're the ones in that chess match that can excel. Some are good because they're able to motivate players and have them do more than they thought they could. So interpersonal skills for some coaches become critical, and for all coaches. But for some, that's really why they shine. Others, it's preparation. They are extremely hard workers, and they prepare. Some are great teachers of their skills. And either some of those areas or combinations of those areas, I think, allow coaches to succeed or not do as well.
Is there anything else that you would like to share or talk about for your coaching at Middletown over the years?
Yeah, something I've wanted to share for some time. To the fans that used to yell at me, run the ball to the wide side of the field. There's a lot in football, in my opinion, when I call it an offense, and calling the offense was a lot of fun. You ask me if I missed something, calling the offense. Holding the joystick during the game, that's the coolest thing ever. But there's a lot of numbers game that goes on. We play Delaware Wing T, which is a balanced offense. You have the center, the quarterback, and the fullback lined up. And then you have a guard, tackle, and a back on each side. So it's a balanced offense. Well, we ran up against a lot of teams that would play a 4-4 defense. So you've got 5 defenders on each side of the ball, and a safety. It's a balanced defense. Perfect for going against the wing T. Other defenses are imbalanced, like 52 Monster is imbalanced. Anyway, we ran up against a lot of 4-4s. So what I would do was, particularly in freshman games, because they wouldn't have coaches up in the press box, I would run an unbalanced formation that kids wouldn't recognize. You can unbalance your offense in 2 different ways. You can unbalance the backs, you can unbalance the linemen. So I run a formation which was the Delaware Wing T, the classic East and West as we called it. And I would put the split end on the same side as the tight end. So I had an extra lineman on that side. I would do that to my side of the field. The kids didn't recognize it. The coaches on the other side of the field couldn't see it. The kids didn't recognize it. They had a balanced defense and I had an unbalanced offense with a man advantage. And I would always run it to my sideline, towards me, away from them. We'd run the buck sweep. Now, the buck sweep isn't really a run for the sideline play. It's actually a play that's run in an alley, almost off tackle. So the split end would pull the corner out too wide. And we had our man advantage, and we would run the ball into the boundary again and again and again. Those fans would say, run to the wide side, run to the wide side. And I would grin and think, you don't know what I'm doing. So the first quarter, we'd run all the plays to the left. The second quarter, we'd run all the plays to the right, because we ran them right back to my sideline. And we would go an entire game, and the other team would never recognize it, nor would some of the fans either. Just as I'll take a man advantage going to the boundary every single time. Give me an extra guy. Yeah, so all you fans who thought how stupid I was running the sweep into the boundary, now you might know. A little method to the madness.
And finally, one question. So you were on the coaching staff when a young Brett Myers was a player. So Brett has recently resigned. I'm just curious if you have anything you'd like to say more like directly to him.
Brett, you're an amazing coach. You applied the lessons you learned from Dennis Etsy, and you did all those things in ways that I think he couldn't even do them. You have a gift for how to get along with a wide variety of people. You're able to motivate and work with some people that other coaches may be challenged to work with, to get the most out of them, to have them get the most out of themselves, and to understand that they are a valued part of a community. That community would be that team of football players and the rest of the school. And those lessons will go with them far beyond where football ever takes them. The other thing is home football games. I don't coach any longer, obviously. Home football is truly a community event in Middletown. And I go, my wife stays at home because I have a lot of people to talk to. It's like a reunion every game. All those people that I see on Facebook, they're there. I get lots of hugs. It's pretty sweet. I get some nice treatment there, but that's it. It is a community event. And a lot of people are part of it. And I think that's one of the things that's special about this small community that we have and the pride that it has in its football. Yeah, so I went to Lower Dauphin, but my heart's here in Middletown.
Did you have favorite football players?
I don't think you get any coach to answer that question.
We're going to talk about your experiences with Middletown football and just Middletown as a community, with Middletown as a community as a whole.
So I guess I didn't answer your question very well. Make sure that doesn't make it on anything.
Right.
Edit that out.
Mr. Taylor was the physics teacher, right?
Yes, he was. Yes, he was.
You guys had that science bond.
Yeah, we did.
Tell him I'm still angry that he failed me my senior year. No, I earned that one. I was going to say, I know for the 93 and 94 when I was playing, there were definitely a couple of games where I wasn't buying what they were selling as far as, trying to motivate us for like, I don't know, whoever the worst team.
Don't put this on, but one time